It is now my pleasure to introduce our special guest expert, Jeni Bulcock. Jeni is a UX researcher and experience design strategist based in New York City. She's spearheaded strategic design initiatives and digital transformation programs across various industries for both customer experience and employee experience initiatives. Her portfolio boasts an array of national and global brands, including Samsung, Square, IKEA, AIG, Better, and Kraft Heinz, among others. She's passionate about conducting and advocating for UX research within organizations and engaging with the wider research community. Outside of work, you'll find Jeni exploring the parks and restaurants of New York City with her Australian Shepherd, Nico. All right, well, Jeni, without any further ado, please take it away.
Thank you, Helen. Let me get my screen share set up. Is that working for everybody? Yes, thumbs up.
Looks great.
Thank you so much. So yeah, thank you, Helen, Raymond, and Ellen for having me. It's really great to be here today, and happy Friday for everyone else. First thing I want to do is ask you all, how would you rate the level of impact that research is having in your organization? And you can put it in the chat. So 1 is very low, 5 is very high. I'm curious to hear from you. Great, wow, some 4s. 3, some 3s, okay. -1. I'm sorry, Faith, that sounds frustrating. 3 to 5 remote hugs. I love that, Miles. 2. Okay, so a mix. Great. Well, hopefully after today, everyone can walk away with some new approaches and some inspiration. So does any of this sound familiar? Have you ever produced a comprehensive research report full of quotes and diagrams, maybe even video snippets, only to be told, just send me the executive summary? And if you've experienced any of these scenarios that I'm going to run through now, feel free to tell us about them in the chat as well. Or maybe you've realized that your product and design colleagues are circling around a problem area, not realizing that research insights already exist that could help guide them. Or maybe you are finding it challenging to get your team or stakeholders to engage with research and leverage it to make decisions. See people finding some similarities in their own experience in the chat. Number 2 and 3. Okay. So we researchers are knowledge creators. So that means that the more people that have access to and awareness of UX research insights, the more impact we can have in the organization. So what we really need to do is think about an engagement strategy. And this will help us improve our awareness of the research insights, access to the research insights, ensure the insights don't sit on a shelf, that they're utilized. It'll also help us create influence and increased impact. And I think maybe most importantly, it helps us build trust with our stakeholders. So like any good design process, it's good to understand the current state. In particular, what I'm going to be focusing on today is who are the people who consume research in your organization and what environment do they exist within? So how do people work? What's the organizational culture? These types of things. Because it's important to understand how your company operates so that you can work within existing behaviors and meet your stakeholders where they are, or maybe in some cases you want to change their behaviors. because not every organizational culture or stakeholder group is the same. Each organizational culture is slightly different and they make decisions slightly differently. I see that some people have worked in various companies over the past few years, and I'm sure you've experienced some of this. And of course, within the organization, different groups of people might have different preferences for consuming information. So what do we do? Well, this is where our skill set of being researchers comes into play. I want you to put on those interviewing, put those interviewing skills to use, and use your sense of curiosity to get to work and get to know the people who will benefit from consuming the work. I want you to build connections with them. Understanding them helps you craft the experience of working with you and consuming the deliverables that you produce in a way that speaks to them. And all of this ensures that your work is more likely to get traction. Now, when you're having these discussions and these conversations, my tip here is to disguise them as a friendly connection to alleviate any sort of political concerns. Frame it as I'm getting to know you. So here's some topics to help you get started. What's their experience with research? Have they worked with a researcher before? What is their definition of research? How do they make decisions? I've been in organizations that are heavily skewed to quant data, and that's how they like to make decisions. And you need to sort of educate them about the qual side of things as well. What is their appetite for complexity or density of information? And this is a big one that will come into play as I continue through this talk. What decisions are they hoping to make with the research? What business or personal goals are they trying to achieve? This one's also really important, and it helps you frame conversations and insights in a way that speaks to them. And also, do they have any current hypotheses or deeply held beliefs? AKA, do they have any biases? The other thing to do is take an observant eye to the organizational culture. So how does the organization share information? What touch points do they use? What behaviors do they have? Where and how is information stored, if at all? I've definitely been in organizations where people were doing research and it would sit on their own laptop or own filing system, and it wasn't accessible to everybody else. What tools have organizational-wide access? So if you were going to leverage existing software and platforms, what's going to help you disseminate your information organizational-wide? And is there a preference for written documents or verbal presentations? Again, this has come up in my experience in different organizations. Sometimes there's a strong preference for one or the other. Is the company remote, distributed, or is there some in-person contact time? So are you working synchronously or asynchronously? And maybe what's the ratio between the two? And then do these preferences differ by group? So you might realize that your peers have a very different preference for consuming information versus the leadership team or the executive team. And so what are these nuances? Because by understanding how people want to communicate, you can communicate with different groups of people in an approach that suits them. Because ultimately, being respectful of their time and their needs will go a really long way and also help you build that trust. So the next thing we do here is we need to start defining the experience. So you may have experienced this. I've definitely done this in the past, but generally when we're squeezed for time, we tend to focus on the content or deliverable and not the consumption experience. So this is where we start to think about the experience design of working with a researcher. How do you want someone to work with you and consume your work? So armed with all those organizational insights you've captured from before, you'll be better positioned to create moments and places where people can connect with the work and you in a way that's valuable to them. So that's what we're going to focus on next. So to do this, I find it helpful to think about the research process in terms of a journey or an experience. The journey phases may differ by type of program. So you may not always have a one-size-fits-all approach. For example, I've mapped out 3 phases here today, but you might decide that you have 4 or more. But by thinking about what you intend to achieve at each stage of the journey, you can be more strategic about how you might want to disseminate that information and build connections with your stakeholders. So this helps your stakeholders engage with all phases of the research process, and we build trust, alignment, and create research advocates, which is a huge, huge plus. Now, as I said, your journey might differ, but here's an example of how you might break it down into phases. And you can see here that each phase has slightly different goals. So for example, in the planning phase, here's where you're creating buy-in to do the study. You're aligning on goals, timelines, scope, methods, deliverables with your stakeholders or partners. Then the next phase is what I've called gather or synthesize. And this is where you start to make your process of conducting research more visible. It helps build awareness of the work, and you'll probably be sharing interim findings, which increases trust in the insights. And then in the deliver phase, here's where you might be answering research questions, building deeper level of empathy, validating or invalidating hypotheses, identifying opportunities, making experience recommendations or feature recommendations, and potentially facilitating next steps. So just a quick overview of how I sometimes break out the journey. So once you've defined the phases of your process, you can then think about the best ways to engage with people. So take your learnings about your stakeholders and the organizational culture and marry them with the phases and the experience you want to create. So now there's a few things you want to keep in mind and a few things you want to think about. So namely, content density. So generally speaking, again, in my experience, the higher up in an organization you go, the appetite for content dense presentations reduces. So keep your audience top of mind here. One framework I like to keep in mind is the bite, snack, and kneel framework. You're familiar with that? And it's a great way to categorize the types of content you share. You can determine how you want to break this down in a way that makes sense for you, but here's a suggestion of something I've done before. So a bite, for example, might be a quote from an interview. A snack might be a single synthesized theme about a topic area. And then a meal might be the full report. So you can sort of see that we've got a hierarchy of content density that we're playing with there. The next thing to think about is how you might want to engage or share information. So is it going to be synchronously or asynchronously? And the cultural preferences come into play quite heavily here. So sharing synchronously has its advantages. You can add context when needed, and people can ask questions, and you can have some nice back and forth and good discussion. And I generally find that it's that discussion time when you're presenting the findings that can help the team internalize the content and move forward in a meaningful way. Discussions generally add a lot more richness to your insights, and it's really engaging for the team. On the flip side of that, obviously, we have sharing asynchronously. Maybe you have a team that's dispersed across time zones, or maybe people have limited availability. And so async works best here. It also has its advantages, and it helps you reach a wider audience potentially as well. So they both have their pros and cons. One thing to think about is also, is there a way to combine the two? So for example, you might record a presentation and then make it available to the whole organization. And then the third thing here is shelf life. So think about, is this something that can be ephemeral, like a status update about the program? Or does it need to be findable in the future, like a full report? So for example, you might also decide that large content-dense reports should have long shelf lives, whereas insight bites can have shorter shelf lives. Alternatively, you might decide to base this on long or short-term decisions. For example, does the information tie into overarching company strategy or business strategy? Is the study helping deliver findings that relate to short or long-term wins? And so that might also help you decide what the shelf life should be. So now we've got our framework. We understand the organization, and that helps us define the experience. Ultimately, the goal here is to make your work more accessible, memorable, and engaging, and increase the level of impact your work can have in the org. Pause here and see if there's any questions before I move on. Not yet, okay. So at this point, you're probably wondering, what does this look like in practice? And I've put some examples together for you for inspiration. All right, so when in the planning phase, this is something that I do to help facilitate the planning process with stakeholders who have very low familiarity with research, or maybe they haven't worked with research before at all. So as part of the research plan document, where I've outlined the goals, methods, participants for the study, I also provide some sample data. And this is, I've got a little mock-up of what that could be in the table. It shows stakeholders what type of insights the study will generate. And so it helps to have that early conversation about qual versus quant data, and also ensures that the research goals are accurate, because it indicates what types of decisions the data will help inform. So you can have a really good discussion with your stakeholder about, we're doing this because of X, and you're going to be able to use this to make X decisions. And so it eases their concerns around, you know, what are they going to get from this work? Thanks. See the comment in the chat. So the next example here I've got is for, in my journey phases, the gather or synthesis phase. So here, a little while ago, I was running a high-profile research study that was going to be presented to the executive team and inform roadmap planning. Now, I didn't have direct access to the executive team, which I'm sure is somewhat of a common occurrence, but I knew I needed to find a way to bring them along on the research journey and ensure that they had buy-in of the findings. So what I chose to do was I leveraged the existing communication channels. And this organization specifically was a heavy user of Slack. So lots of async communication. And I prepared a weekly video to showcase program updates. So this included what happened this week, what was coming up next week, and also I started to tease out emerging insights to keep them apprised of what we were learning. Now, the video, it was only about 10 minutes long, so not too long, not too short, just enough time to share work in progress and still have it be very engaging. So this allowed me to generate awareness of the program and the research team, and create a mechanism for sharing interim findings, which then helped me build stakeholder buy-in early in the program, which was imperative, it turned out, because it meant that they trusted the data, even when the findings were not favorable, which in this case, they were not. Another method I sometimes leverage during the synthesis phase is a synthesis workshop. So this brings the team directly into the research process, and it's a great way to share data with the team early. So if you have a team that is pressed for time, eager to know what's eager to know what you're learning, eager to have the insights, not prepared to wait for you to do the synthesis and the report writing, this could be a great way to help ease those concerns. So here I'll create a workshop canvas with the raw data, and then I'll step the team through a series of activities to affinity map and create themes and opportunities. And by asking them to do some of the synth work, they're more likely to internalize the findings and feel ownership of the outcomes. It also means that they help you do a little bit of the synthesis as well. So it's a little bit of a time saver if you can manage it. And then in the deliver phase, I wanted to share this one. So now that we're all moving back into the office or maybe a hybrid environment, I wanted to include this example for those of us who are back to collaborating with colleagues in person. This one is the insight wall, or sometimes called the wall, where you can post your learnings and insights and synthesize them along the way to tell a story over time. So you could do this with insights. You could do this in a journey map format, if it lends itself to that, and annotate your pains and opportunities, and then of course update that journey as solutions are built and shipped. And so it's a really nice way of engaging with your team and bringing the data to them. And it creates opportunities for cross-functional conversations. You know, we talk about having water cooler conversations. You know, the same thing could happen at the insight wall. But of course, there are far, far more ways to create engagement. And so the next couple of slides, I've outlined some additional methods. Now, in this table, you'll see that I'm trying to tie these back to the work we've already done. So, for example, the understanding the organizational culture and preferences. So, for example, the gray columns relate to culture and consumption preferences, and the purple columns speak to the phase of the research journey. And again, this might differ for you. And then you'll notice at the end there, I've got an evergreen column, and that sort of speaks to shelf life and helps you start thinking about a repository. So I'll walk through just a couple of these and voice them over. The first one is top-line findings or bite-size content. So in this example, I'm referring to emerging insights from a study. And in the past, I've curated and shared these via Slack because short form is easy to digest and share. And in previous environments, I've witnessed that people tag their colleagues and stakeholders, which means that the bite-size insight is organically dispersed through the organization. So if that works for you, it could be really successful. The next method I want to talk about is the group workshop. Now, this is a great tool and it can be used in several ways. I walked through the example before of the synthesis workshop in the gather phase, but you might also choose to use it in the planning phase. For example, maybe you have a list of research questions and you need your team to prioritize them. So a facilitated prioritization workshop can help you align really quickly. Another fun method, it's a little out of the box, is the idea of a quiz. This can be an engaging way to share interim findings with your team, and it works very well for teams who are time poor or need some encouragement to engage with the research. And by framing key takeaways as either a truth or false question, or maybe a multiple choice, the findings become more memorable, engaging, and consumable. And it also creates a great way to spark deeper conversations about the why, or why do people think that? Why did we, why is this important? Why do you think that might be? And so it's a really great engagement mechanism. Now with the quiz, it is somewhat ephemeral, so I wouldn't recommend it as a final deliverable, but rather a way to tease insights and generate interest and interest for people to dig deeper into the full report later on. The next method I want to chat about before we move on is the journey map, because this also has a couple of use cases. This can be used as a collaborative work session to help teams interpret and internalize raw data. Assuming you have longitudinal data, you can ask the team to synthesize it across the journey. Or of course, it can be used as a deliverable that highlights key takeaways and opportunity areas. So there's a lot of different ways you can use these things. I will say though that if you are working on a large study with multiple levels of stakeholders, it's a good idea to select a few socialization tactics to appeal to all interested parties. So Patricia, yes, sometimes you might want to create a couple of different methods or mechanisms for people to engage with you, especially during the lifespan of your program through all those phases that I've been talking about. So like with any good design project, I encourage you to explore, experiment, and prototype. See what works for you and your organization. And I'd love to hear about how this has helped increase the level of impact of research in your organization. So please feel free to get in touch and keep me posted.
Jeni, we have some great questions for you in the chat. Let's see. Somebody mentions, I love the idea of a weekly video update. Were you able to gather analytics on engagement with those videos?
No, because they were just shared predominantly via Slack as the main channel of communication between me and the executive team. But that's a great idea, especially if you wanted to share them organizational wide. You could see, which teams, which locations, depending on the size of the org, which roles were engaging with the content. It's a great idea.
I imagine it varies team by team too.
It could, yeah. In this instance, the videos were largely leveraged as a status update and give the research teams some presence bottom up, because we didn't have direct access to these people. So it was a way to create a human connection without actually creating or having the human connection. And that was the advantage of that method in that instance. But to your point, it could have many.
I'm curious if there was duplication. Like, for example, would you post that short video update, but then maybe also post the same content in text in case somebody couldn't dip into it?
Yeah. I didn't mention it here, but in conjunction with those video updates, I would also push insight nuggets or bite-sized content to other Slack channels where I thought they might be interesting. And so this is where I saw a lot of engagement organizational wide with people tagging their colleagues, cross-functional partners, and starting to create a thread, within the post itself. So yes, there was definitely a two-sided approach to sharing bite-sized content and status updates and those sorts of things.
I love this multi-pronged approach. Let's see. So I think I saw another question. Is there a chance that we face backlash from leadership when we share works in progress instead of the complete study report? What might that look like?
In my experience, the more you can do to build awareness of and build a relationship with your stakeholders, the better. the more familiar that they are around what you're doing, why, and what you're learning, the more receptive they're going to be to the final output. Now, in the example I just shared with the video, I wasn't asking them for time on their calendars. You know, I wasn't asking for a big lift of effort or time from them. And so that worked really well. But I will say it might differ for different organizational cultures. Maybe they're not interested in learning about emerging insights, understanding at a deeper level what you're doing. Maybe they do just want the output. Actually, speaking about this reminds me of an instance where that happened to me in a different organization, obviously, but I had suggested one of my synthesis workshops because I wanted the team to immerse in the findings and have a good discussion with them about what we were learning. And one of the senior member stakeholders said, no, I don't have the time. I'm not interested. Just give me the report. So yes, it can happen. And it's really about gauging and understanding the organizational culture and the people that you're working with. In this particular instance, I had really high level stakeholders and peers. So I had a variety of levels. And of course, the more senior levels didn't want to spend the time, but the lower levels did. So yeah, that's something that factored in to that scenario.
Sense. Let's see. We have another question. I like the idea of using Slack for the bite-sized insights. Is it ideal to create a Slack channel just for this? For example, you know, hashtag UX research. This person has a channel for the entire digital products department, but it feels more like a channel to get updates from leadership.
Interesting. I will say that, yes, that's something I've done before in organizations, is create a UXR channel and then push insights to that channel. It does mean that people need to go check it and engage with it. So it doesn't necessarily need to be the only place you post. For example, if there's a project team or a person you know would be most interested in what you're posting, feel free to post it there as well. Another option that might make sense is to create, depending on the scope of the research program, a research project specific channel, so that anyone who's involved in that particular area of focus can opt in and receive those things directly. So again, it's really just about the organization and who's going to use the insights, who they're valuable for.
That makes sense. Okay, let's see. Got another question here. Oh, actually, it looks like this was a comment. Let's see, let me just double check. Oh, how successful have you been with involving people in synthesis who were not in the original research?
So I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, but generally speaking, very successful, especially with my colleagues who are the ones who will be consuming and acting on those insights. I generally find that there's a high level of interest and engagement in doing that and participating in that, especially if you frame it as I want you to come into my world. I want you to see what I've been learning. And together, we're going to come out the other side of it with some opportunities or some solutions. I think it's really important to tie it from raw data all the way through to the outcome that you want to achieve from that workshop, because it needs to be valuable for them just as much as it needs to be valuable for you. So yeah, closing out the workshop with some sort of alignment or decision or list of solutions or priorities is really where you want those types of workshops to end. But it does also have the other advantage of bringing people into your process, immersing them in the findings and the data, so that anything that you do come up with and the outcomes of those, they're bought into and they have some shared ownership of, which ultimately just means that they're going to be more successful as you move through and build and ship.
I really love all the multiple methods that you've presented. And I'm wondering, as you enter a new organization and find that maybe one of those particular tailor-made choices doesn't seem to be getting any traction, do you see that as an opportunity to pivot to something else that might work better, or maybe do more promo and get them used to the method that you were trying?
Great question. I really think it all comes down to, what are you trying to achieve? For example, maybe you've just joined a new company and you hit this roadblock, if you will. You might want to understand why. And so going back to the beginning and thinking about the organizational culture and the people that you're working with, and digging a little bit deeper into what that sort of current state or environment looks like, that's where I would recommend you start. And then that'll help you either finesse or pivot your approach. I would start there first, because you want to build trust and engagement in your work and research as a whole. And then over time, if you decide you want to change some of those behaviors, you can do so. Again, I would recommend doing it slowly and over time, so that you don't erode any of that goodwill and trust that you've built up earlier on.
That makes sense. Let me see. I think I saw one more question, I think, and then we can move to breakout rooms for anyone who's interested. Let's see. Have you tried a flip the script approach, where you send out the readout in advance and then use the meeting more for Q&A and discussion?
What? I've done that most recently in a workshop format. So there was content I needed people to have a awareness of and understanding of prior to joining the workshop. So there was a pre-read that got sent out. However, I do recommend you factor in 5 or 10 minutes in the workshop agenda, because not everyone is going to have the time to do that pre-read. And in order for the workshop to be successful, you want everyone to be on the same page. So it's still something I would account for in a session to help them move through the workshop activities. But you could do something really similar with a readout and a Q&A session. Send the readout out, and then you could factor in 5 or 10 minutes within your meeting agenda, again, to just get people to arrive, land, familiarize themselves with the content, and formulate any last minute questions. So yes, definitely think about it, give it a go. Let me know how it goes.
I see that I missed a couple of questions. Some people were asking about the tooling. For example, do you have a favorite journey map template? And let's see, also those online quiz tools where people could select the answer before the presenter revealed the answer. Does anyone have any other tools like that they would like to volunteer?
Yeah, that's a great one for the community if you want to post in the chat. I'll answer the first part first about journey maps. I don't have a great answer for you, because I create them all bespoke to the organization and the data and the story I want to tell. I will say I do that in Figma, if that's of any help, because I want something that's very visual and engaging, and it becomes an asset that's enjoyable to look at. And, you know, people tend to want to share those things through the organization more readily. And then I think the next half of that question was about tools for quizzes, right?
Mm-hmm. And I know that some people jumped in in the chat, but if you have any particular recommendations, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I think just using Zoom poll features and things in the past is what I've done. But I'm sure there's a website somewhere. In other worlds, in other lives, there's something called Slido that I've used to capture feedback remotely. You could probably use that as a way to capture answers to questions. So anyway, I'm sure there's a variety of different tools on the internet that would help facilitate the design of a quiz. You could even actually, now that I'm thinking about it, you could even use Google Forms or Microsoft Forms and then share back live the results.
Yeah, it looks like there's a bunch of different ways, some that are dedicated to getting those particular answers in the just being scrappy and using what tools you have available.
Right, and if your team is quite small, you could just get people to post in the chat. You know, really, it's just about developing engagement and getting them to immerse themselves in the data a little bit more and bring a little bit more awareness to what you're doing. So any way to foster engagement that works.
That makes sense. Considering your wide range of experiences, we have an attendee who says they have experience from consulting in-house, both public and private. Could you speak more about the ways that leveraging empathy with research across these different contexts might look?
I too have worked in consulting and in-house. In my experience in the consulting world, the program timeline was largely set or defined. And so you needed to plan in these engagement moments from day one and have an idea of what you wanted that to look like. In my experience in consulting, we would run quite a few workshops, whether they were to present findings, immerse people in findings, or get them to align on solution areas or problem areas. So lots of workshops in consulting. Also, we employed the insight wall. The project team would have an entire room and we would fill up walls sometimes with insights. And so with that, we would invite the client over and say, hey, come and look at what we've been doing, and literally walk them through the wall, walk them through all the insights on the wall that we'd captured and tell the story of what we're learning and have them ask questions and have a really good engaging discussion that way. In-house, in my experience, it affords you a little bit more flexibility. You're usually working more closely with your partners or colleagues or peers. And so you can run these things more ad hoc. So for example, the quiz is a great one, sharing things via Slack, and I tend to find that if you're in-house, people want that information as soon as you hear about it, rather than being prepared to wait until you've packaged something up in a more consumable format. So that's something I've noticed from being a consultant versus embedded in-house.
All right, this is great. I think I believe I was able to cover the questions that I saw. So